There's a sickness in the American dream, and it doesn't announce itself with sirens or flashing lights. It walks through the front door dressed in a three-piece suit, carrying a briefcase full of promises. It speaks your language, it knows your fears, and it always sounds too good to be true, until you're convinced it isn't. This is a story about belief, about the moment when skepticism surrenders to hope, about ordinary people who handed over their life savings to men who smiled while they stole, and about the American tradition of packaging greed as opportunity. 3 scams, 3 different decades. One lesson we keep refusing to learn. Boston, 1920. The First World War had just ended, and America was drunk on the promise of prosperity. Factories were humming, jazz was in the air, and a man named Charles Ponzi was sitting in a small office on School Street, holding what he claimed was the secret to instant wealth. Ponzi was an Italian immigrant with slicked-back hair, a charming accent, and absolutely nothing to lose. He'd tried half a dozen businesses before this one, all failures, all forgotten. But this time, he'd stumbled onto something that sounded brilliant in its simplicity: international postal reply coupons, boring, bureaucratic instruments that could be bought in one country and redeemed for stamps in another. Ponzi claimed he'd found a loophole in the exchange rates. Buy coupons cheap in Italy, redeem them for more expensive American stamps, profit from the difference. It wasn't true. Not even close. But it didn't need to be. Ponzi promised investors a 50% return in 45 days. 50%. In a world where bank accounts paid 3% annually, Ponzi was offering the moon, and people lined up to touch it. The first investors were skeptical, cautious. They put in small amounts, testing the waters, and then, like clockwork, Ponzi paid them back, with interest, exactly what he promised, exactly when he promised it. Word spread like fire through dry grass. If your neighbor doubled his money in 6 weeks, you'd be a fool not to do the same. The line outside Ponzi's office stretched around the block. Clerks and shopkeepers, widows and immigrants, people who'd never invested a dollar in their lives suddenly became believers in Charles Ponzi's genius. They brought their rent money, their children's college funds, their life savings wrapped in handkerchiefs. Ponzi took it all. The mechanics were brutally simple. There were no postal coupons, no international trades, no secret loophole. Ponzi was paying early investors with money from new investors, a human conveyor belt of cash moving from the hopeful to the greedy and back again. As long as new believers kept arriving, the machine kept running. For a few glorious months, Charles Ponzi was the most popular man in Boston. He bought a mansion with servants and air conditioning. He smoked cigars that cost more than his investors made in a week. He posed for photographs like a visiting dignitary, and he kept promising that everyone would get rich if they just believed a little longer. The collapse came fast. A journalist started asking questions Ponzi couldn't answer. An auditor discovered the postal coupon story was mathematically impossible at the scale Ponzi claimed. The house of cards didn't fall. It evaporated. Within days, the crowds outside Ponzi's office shifted from hopeful to furious. They wanted their money back. It was gone. All of it. Ponzi served 3.5 years in federal prison. When he was released, he tried the scheme again in Florida, selling swampland as prime real estate. It didn't work the second time. He died broke in 1949 in a Brazilian charity hospital, a forgotten man. But his name lived forever. Every pyramid scheme, every too-good-to-be-true investment, every fraud that pays old victims with new victims' money, they all carry his name now. The Ponzi scheme, the original American hustle, the lie that started it all. Charles Ponzi stole roughly $20 million in today's money. That sounds catastrophic. But here's the thing about seeds. They grow. Fast forward 70 years. The year is 1998, and America's wealth is no longer concentrated in factory towns and tenement neighborhoods. It's moved to retirement accounts and offshore islands, and a man named Stanford has figured out how to tap into both. Stanford wasn't selling postal coupons. He was selling something far more intoxicating: exclusivity. His company, Stanford Financial Group, promised returns of 10 to 15% annually, consistent, stable, safe. The kind of returns that made wealthy retirees feel smart without feeling reckless. And unlike Ponzi's cramped office in Boston, Stanford operated from the Caribbean island of Antigua, where palm trees swayed and regulation was negotiable. Stanford looked the part, tall, silver-haired, with the polished veneer of old money, even though he'd grown up middle class in Texas. He threw lavish parties, he sponsored cricket tournaments, he owned a private jet and a fleet of luxury cars. He surrounded himself with the kind of opulence that whispers, "This man knows what he's doing," and people believed him. Not working-class immigrants this time, wealthy Americans, educated professionals, people who should have known better, but were seduced by the same thing Ponzi's victims had been, steady returns that seemed too good to question. Stanford's pitch was brilliant in its simplicity. He claimed his fund invested in safe, diversified international securities managed by expert analysts on Antigua. The island location gave it an air of sophistication, offshore finance, tax advantages, the kind of thing rich people do, and the returns were modest enough to seem plausible. Not Ponzi's 50% in 6 weeks, just a reliable 10% year after year. Boring, steady, trustworthy, it was all fiction. Stanford was running the same con Ponzi had invented, just with better branding. He took money from new investors and used it to pay returns to old investors. The only difference was scale and presentation. Ponzi had stolen millions. Stanford stole billions. $7 billion to be exact, and he did it over 20 years without raising significant alarm because he'd learned Ponzi's lesson. Don't be too greedy. Don't promise the moon. Promise 10% and deliver it like clockwork. The secret to Stanford's longevity was simple. He didn't operate in the American regulatory system. He built his empire in Antigua, where financial oversight was a joke, and politicians could be bought with cricket sponsorships and campaign contributions. He hired former government officials to sit on his boards, lending credibility. He advertised in respectable financial magazines. He sponsored professional tennis and golf. He became a fixture in high society, the kind of man who gets invited to charity galas and political fundraisers, and beneath it all, the fraud hummed along quietly. Stanford's investment portfolio, the one that supposedly generated those steady returns, didn't exist. The money sat in his personal accounts, funding his lifestyle and paying off earlier investors who asked for withdrawals. It was a magic trick performed with spreadsheets and offshore bank accounts, sustained entirely by new deposits and the willingness of victims to believe. The collapse came in 2009 during the financial crisis. When markets crashed and investors panicked, they wanted their money back, all of it, at once. Stanford couldn't deliver. The Securities and Exchange Commission finally raided his offices and found what should have been obvious years earlier: empty accounts and fabricated records. $7 billion had vanished into yachts and mansions and cricket stadiums. Alan Stanford was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. He's currently serving his time in Florida, insisting to anyone who will listen that he's innocent. His victims, many of them retirees who lost their entire life savings, received pennies on the dollar in the eventual settlement. Stanford had upgraded Ponzi's model. He'd added sophistication, offshore mystique, and institutional credibility. He'd stretched the con across 2 decades instead of 2 years. But the core mechanism remained identical: rob Peter, to pay Paul, and smile while you do it. The seed Ponzi planted had grown into a tree, but it was about to become a forest. December 2008. The American economy was in free fall. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. The housing market had imploded. Unemployment was spiking. And in a quiet Manhattan office, a 70-year-old investment manager named Bernard Madoff was about to reveal the largest financial fraud in human history. $65 billion. Not million, billion. With a B. Madoff didn't invent the Ponzi scheme, but he perfected it. He industrialized it. He turned it into a machine that ran for nearly 5 decades, destroying thousands of lives while he lived in penthouses and beach houses and collected vintage watches. And the truly terrifying part? Almost everyone who should have stopped him believed in him completely. Bernard Madoff was Wall Street royalty. He'd helped create the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. He'd served as chairman of the board. He sat on SEC advisory committees, literally helping write the rules designed to catch people like him. He was respected, connected, trusted at the highest levels of finance. When you invested with Bernie Madoff, you weren't taking a risk. You were joining an exclusive club. That exclusivity was the key. Madoff didn't advertise. He didn't pitch. He made you beg to give him your money. His fund was invitation only, accessible mainly through exclusive feeder funds and country clubs. If you got in, you felt lucky, special, part of an elite group that had access to Madoff's secret strategy. The returns were perfect, not spectacular. Madoff had learned from Ponzi's mistake. He delivered 10 to 12% annually, year after year, regardless of market conditions. When the stock market crashed, Madoff's fund stayed positive. When markets soared, Madoff's returns were steady. It was the consistency that seduced people. In a volatile world, Bernie Madoff offered certainty, except there were no investments, none, zero. For nearly 50 years, every dollar that came into Madoff's fund went into a Chase bank account where it sat until someone asked for a withdrawal or Madoff needed to fund his lavish lifestyle. He fabricated trade confirmations. He created fake statements showing diversified portfolios that didn't exist. He hired a staff whose only job was to maintain the illusion. And when regulators came asking questions, which they did multiple times, Madoff charmed them. He was Bernie Madoff, former Nasdaq chairman, Wall Street legend, the man who literally wrote the textbook on market making. Of course his returns were real. Of course his strategy was sound. The SEC investigated him 5 times and found nothing suspicious, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the idea that Bernie Madoff could be running a Ponzi scheme seemed absurd. The fraud survived recessions, market crashes, and regulatory investigations. It survived because Madoff had built something Ponzi and Stanford never had: institutional trust. He wasn't a charismatic immigrant or a smooth-talking Texan. He was an establishment figure, woven into the fabric of American finance. Questioning Bernie Madoff felt like questioning gravity. The end came not from investigators, but from math. In December 2008, as the financial crisis crushed the economy, Madoff's clients wanted their money back. $7 billion in redemption requests in a single week. Madoff couldn't cover it. The bank account was nearly empty. The entire 5-decade fraud collapsed in 72 hours. Madoff confessed to his sons. His sons reported him to the FBI. Within days, the world knew. The man who'd sat on charity boards and donated millions to Jewish causes and hobnobbed with celebrities had stolen everything. Entire charities were wiped out. Pension funds evaporated. Retirees who'd built their lives around Madoff's steady returns woke up to discover they had nothing. Bernie Madoff died in prison in 2021, serving a 150-year sentence. He never explained why, never offered a satisfactory answer for how a man could look thousands of people in the eye, people who trusted him with their futures, and lie for 50 years. He just did it. Because he could, because people believed. Madoff's fraud was Ponzi's seed grown into a monster. It proved that the con doesn't need to evolve. It just needs better packaging, better credentials, better access. The mechanics are always the same. Promise returns you can't deliver, pay old investors with new investors' money, and hope the music never stops. But the music always stops. Always. The numbers don't capture it. 7 billion, 65 billion. The figures are too large to comprehend, too abstract to feel. So focus on this instead. A 73-year-old man in New Jersey who invested his entire retirement with Madoff. He'd worked 45 years as a teacher. Every dollar he'd saved, every sacrifice he'd made, gone. He shot himself 3 months after the fraud was revealed. His wife found him in the garage. A charitable foundation that funded cancer research. Madoff's fraud wiped out their endowment completely. The research stopped. The scientists moved on to other projects. The patients who might have been saved by that research will never know they were collateral damage in Bernie Madoff's 50-year lie. A couple in their 80s who lived modestly despite being Madoff investors, planning to leave their wealth to their grandchildren. The grandchildren got nothing. The college funds evaporated. The inheritance disappeared. The couple spent their final years not in comfort, but in shame, apologizing to their family for trusting the wrong man. These aren't statistics. They're the wreckage, the human cost of believing that some people are too successful, too connected, too respected to be criminals. Ponzi taught us the con. Stanford showed us how to scale it. Madoff proved that if you wear the right suit and know the right people, you can steal for 50 years and nobody will stop you, not until it's too late. This is day one. 3 scams across a century. 3 men who understood something fundamental about human nature. We want to believe in shortcuts, in secrets, in the idea that somewhere, someone has figured out how to beat the system. Ponzi sold that dream to immigrants in Boston. Stanford sold it to millionaires in Antigua. Madoff sold it to billionaires in Manhattan. Different eras, different victims, same lie. But here's what they have in common with the 18 scams still to come. They all relied on one thing, not greed, not ignorance, belief. The scams got bigger, more sophisticated, more devastating, but they never stopped working because we never stopped believing. Tomorrow, the con moves from individuals to institutions, from Ponzi schemes to something worse. Corporations that lie to millions at once, where the fraud isn't hidden in offshore accounts but buried in balance sheets, where the criminals wear corner office suits and the victims lose more than money. They lose trust in the system itself.